Given the current international situation and climate, I thought it would be a good time to discuss colonialism, and more specifically, colonial myths of righteousness. Because when you dig down deep into the culture, every colonial power has relied on the myth of its own righteousness in order to maintain its own people, to maintain the support of its own people. It's what allows the people living in the colonial power to go to sleep at night and sleep peacefully while their government ravages other countries that may be poorer or less technologically advanced. It's what lets us justify endless wars. And it's what lets us gloss over the atrocities in our own history and present. But colonial and hegemonic systems depend on myths of righteousness because domination is never self evidently legitimate. It must be made to feel natural, moral, and inevitable. These mythologies function as sort of political technologies. They shape how people understand the world whose suffering counts and why violence appears justified rather than outrageous. The reason why these hegemonic powers need mythologies of righteousness is because domination creates a contradiction. A regime that inflicts harm must still present itself as benevolent. Myth making resolves this contradiction by reframing exploitation as virtue. Empires throughout history have rewritten cultural narratives to reinforce their authority and manipulate collective memory, using myths to shape identity and justify their power. These myths typically follow certain themes. They typically claim that the colonizer is civilizing, rescuing, or uplifting supposedly backwards peoples. That violence is regrettable but necessary for order, progress, or divine purpose. That the oppressed are dangerous, inferior, or incapable, making domination appear protective rather than predatory. And that the empire is uniquely moral, so its actions cannot be judged by ordinary ethical standards. This ideological work is not optional. Without it, the naked reality of extraction, coercion, and brutality would be impossible to morally defend. These mythologies operate through several intertwined mechanisms. Narrative control, for instance. Empires reshape stories, histories, and cultural symbols to center their own virtue and obscure their violence. This includes rewriting myths, suppressing counter narratives, and elevating stories that portray imperial rule as destiny or salvation. There's epistemic oppression. Hegemonic powers control what counts as knowledge, whose testimony is believed, and which worldviews are considered legitimate. This creates entire worlds of meaning that make domination appear natural and justified. Hypocrisy is also a structural feature. Colonial systems often preach ideals, civilization, Christianity, democracy, law and order, while violating them in practice on a daily basis. This hypocrisy is not incidental. It is a tool that allows elites to maintain a self image of righteousness while committing cruelty. Jose Rizal's critique of Spanish colonialism highlights how colonial elites used moral posturing to avoid confronting the injustice of their rule. There's also moral inversion. The colonized are blamed for the violence inflicted upon them. Resistance becomes savagery, while repression becomes restoration of order. The populace must be fed these myths because oppression requires mass participation. Soldiers, bureaucrats, settlers, taxpayers, clergy, teachers. Mythologies of righteousness provide the emotional and moral scaffolding that makes ordinary people complicit. These stories act to reduce cognitive dissonance for those benefiting from or participating in violence and oppression. They create a sense of moral superiority, making domination feel like a duty rather than a crime. They bind the populace to the hegemonic project, turning exploitation into a shared national and civilizational mission. And they suppress empathy for the colonized by framing them as threats, burdens, or obstacles to progress. Without these myths, the moral cost of empire would be too high for many people to bear. The deeper political logic is that colonialism is not just a system of material extraction, but a system of meaning making. Violence alone cannot sustain empire. It must be wrapped in stories that make it feel like righteousness. In the end, this is why empires invest heavily in education, religion, media, and cultural production, although not always in quality education. They police not only bodies, but also narratives, memories, and imaginations, and opinions, and beliefs. And this is also why resistance movements often begin with reclaiming stories, histories, and epistemologies. The struggle over narrative and myth is inseparable from the struggle over power and hope.